Magic the Gathering is a collectible trading card game released by Wizards of the Coast in August of 1993. It contains a rich story and features a diverse cast of interesting characters, like this maniacal eugenicist in blue, or like this other maniacal eugenicist in black, or this woman who is so gay that she literally caught fire. Everything was perfect and right with the world until the greedy corporate overlords at Hasbro decided that they needed more money, and so they decided to milk this precious IP for cash by shoving in characters from other franchises until all we get nowadays is rushed slop, and they've ruined my favorite game, and things were better back then. If you, like many others, are a newer Magic fan, you likely know at least one person with this opinion. They're probably a more enfranchised player. They might have started playing when they were in high school. You might have even heard this opinion from one of the prominent figureheads in the Magic community, self-described Magic boomers. And this is the bedtime story that they like to push about what ruined their favorite game and why things nowadays just aren't what they used to be because of product fatigue and power creep and all these cash grabs. But I'd like to give you a different take on the story, because I am an enfranchised player of Magic the Gathering. I was taught to play nearly a decade ago by a gentleman who had been playing since the before times. I have always loved Magic, and I think that Universes Beyond was one of the best things to happen to this game. And I'd like to tell you why. I can already hear you typing out your hate comment. Just hear me out, okay? I can promise I'm not some consumerist shill or a Hasbro plant or whatever. If you watch my other videos, you'll probably figure out I'm anything but that. I want to approach this topic delicately, because I understand that a lot of enfranchised players are going to disagree with me here, but I think there's valuable discussion to be had. The change of Magic's world from one that has no outside IP to one that does might be a binary, but the evolution of its essence from a single universe held together by narrative to a collection of them strung together by the beyond certainly was not. It is a process. It is a mutation. It is a metamorphosis. Like all good academic papers, we'll start by defining our terms. Merriam-Webster defines Magic the Gathering as some nerd that nerds do. Universes Beyond, then, is what happens when you take some other nerd and staple it onto a Magic card. The phenomenon of throwing random characters onto Magic cards started in 2020 with the release of The Walking Dead Secret Lair, and it took off from there. Now, The Walking Dead probably isn't the first brand that you'd imagine would collaborate with Magic. Honestly, though, neither is Transformers, My Little Pony, or Clue. However, I promise that by the end of this video, every brand collaboration in Magic's Universes Beyond collection will make sense, because I think that the system that Wizards has worked out for these products is extremely interesting, and it might even help us to predict how likely your favorite franchise is to collaborate with Magic in the future. This is every product collaboration Magic has done since 2020, as well as the ones that are confirmed for 2025. If you aren't a diehard Magic fan, you probably weren't aware of all of these. Honestly, I wasn't either until I started digging into this. And it's a pretty sizable list considering these brand crossovers only began 4 years ago, which I think certainly contributes to the feeling of product fatigue felt by many Magic fans nowadays. And the inclusion of these outside products didn't happen immediately. Like many things, it happened slowly, then all at once. People like to point to The Walking Dead Secret Lair as the beginning of the end, but it wasn't actually the first crossover product to be introduced into Magic. While it was the first with unique mechanics and the first to be grandfathered into Universes Beyond, Wizards' first exploration into other universes were all the way back in 2017, with a set of promotional cards for HasCon 2017. These included Grimlock, Dinobot Leader, Nerf War, and Sword of Dungeons & Dragons, all unofficial cards that were only available in this exclusive promotion. Magic's collaboration with Extra Life, a charity that supports children's hospitals across the country, also produced 3 unofficial My Little Pony cards in October of 2019, months before the first ever Secret Lair would be released. I think it's important to note that Hasbro owns all 4 of these other properties, Nerf, Transformers, D&D, and My Little Pony, and so their inclusion in later Magic products makes sense, though I'm still waiting on that Nerf-themed Secret Lair. However, the first official Magic cards with properties outside of Magic's canon still were not the Walking Dead cards. Instead, official crossover cards began with reskinned Godzilla cards and Ikoria boosters, as well as Godzilla-themed Land Secret Lair, about 6 months before the Walking Dead cards released. Wizards partnered directly with Toho, the owners of the rights to Godzilla, for this drop, and while who pays who is often very tenuous in these types of licensing deals, I think it's very possible that Toho paid Wizards as part of an advertising spend for the upcoming Godzilla vs. Kong movie that released less than a year after these cards were released. This soft launch of Universes Beyond products was largely overshadowed by a global pandemic starting just a month before these products released, hindering any real data about the popularity of these products. Now, the question following this becomes, why was The Walking Dead the next logical follow-up? Answering this question took me down a rabbit hole of licensing and distribution rights, and now that I've been cursed with this information, you have to be too. So, back in 2019, Hasbro acquired the media company E1, or Entertainment One, in an all-cash buyout valued at around $4 billion. The play gave them ownership rights of brands such as Peppa Pig and PJ Masks that were perfect for a toy company, but also gave them the distribution rights to shows like The Rookie, Designated Survivor, and, you guessed it, The Walking Dead. But Hasbro isn't a television company, and a lot of this stuff was outside of their normal business operations. Reading through the business rationale in the investor release that Hasbro put out following this acquisition makes it clear that these more adult TV shows were absolutely an afterthought in this acquisition. The deal was aimed at strengthening the preschool brands that Hasbro specialized in, and so Hasbro had to look over the rest of E1's catalog to find a way to monetize them. Wizards was clearly already experimenting with the idea of crossover products with the Godzilla cards, and since The Walking Dead was really the only fantasy or sci-fi show in E1's repertoire that made any sense as a crossover product, Hasbro sent it over to Wizards to make something work, and then bam, we got a secret lair. This expansion into television had other noticeable effects as well. Hasbro had already been distributing their kids' shows to Netflix, but with a new catalog of E1's shows that they began distributing as well, they seem to have strengthened their relationship with Netflix. 2020 and 2021 seem to have been the first time when the idea for a Magic the Gathering Netflix show was cemented, as it appears in Hasbro's 2021 end-of-year report with a 2022 release slated, though we all know how that went down. The evidence of this give and take emerged in the Stranger Things secret lair we got in October of 2021, as well as the Arcane secret lair in November of the same year, both promoting new seasons of the two shows in May 2022 and November 2021 respectively. 2021 also featured the first ever crossover set and commander decks. Though not explicitly Universes Beyond, Dungeons & Dragons is another Wizards of the Coast property, and one probably most closely associated with Magic, so its inclusion in the card game didn't rub too many people the wrong way. Bram Stoker's Dracula was the last crossover event of 2021, following a similar format as the Godzilla cards appearing in Ikoria, instead appearing in Crimson Vow. While it wasn't a cooperation I would say I expected, Dracula is in the public domain, and so printing it on Magic cards was likely a fairly easy legal process, and it's a fitting homage to the gothic horror that inspired the Plane of Innistrad. 2022 was when things really went off the rails. Seemingly energized from the not negative to positive reception that their previous endeavors had garnered, and likely catalyzed by the positive sentiment received after announcing future Warhammer 40k and Lord of the Rings crossovers, Wizards went all out in 2022. They opened with a Street Fighter secret lair in February 2022, which was relatively well received, aided primarily by a print-to-demand model and promise that there would be in-universe prints of all the cards in the drop. The next release was the Battle for Baldur's Gate set, another D&D property. While the games themselves are produced by Larian, the rights to distribute them and the IP are still owned by Wizards, and so the tie-in was very natural. It also didn't cause much of a stir due to its adherence to the usual fantasy aesthetic of Magic's worlds. That's unlike the Fortnite secret lair, the next to release. Another exclusively reskinned secret lair, this one I feel makes sense both due to the immense popularity of Fortnite, but also because Hasbro lists Fortnite as a partner brand, which basically means that Hasbro is first in line to make toys for them. Next up were the Warhammer Precons, the first Universes Beyond set to be released exclusively through Commander decks. It was released alongside a connected Blood Bowl secret lair, as well as several other reskinned secret lairs. To the best of my understanding, this was likely the first licensing deal that Hasbro and Wizards went out of their way to cement because of the interconnectedness of the fanbases. The same is likely true for the Lord of the Rings set that was announced at the same time and released in 2023. Ironically enough, both Warhammer and Lord of the Rings had card games already in existence, so these crossovers with Magic seem to be those IPs throwing in the towel, so to speak. It could also point to another rationale amongst the Wizards' corporate staff for Universes Beyond. Beyond increasing the player base, it would put the nail in the coffin of all the other TCGs on the shelf. If Magic became the Fortnite of card games, what reason would you have to play anything else? Sure, maybe Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Would survive, but if Wizards didn't start crossing over, what's to stop Yu-Gi-Oh! From doing the same thing tomorrow? An interesting prisoner's dilemma over market share. Tangent aside, there were two more crossovers left for 2022. First with the musician and known Magic fan, now owner of the One of One ring, Post Malone, in a reskin secret lair, and then in the first mechanically unique booster inserts from the Transformers franchise, which Hasbro also owns, alongside a secret layer of reprint and alternate arts. Okay, 2023, this is where she gets good. First up was the secret lair promoting the Dungeons & Dragons movie, which makes sense from a licensing perspective. Keeping everything in-house makes it easy. I'm sure there was likely some dispute surrounding the likeness of the actors involved, but it was probably covered in their contracts. As for the Lord of the Rings set, the licensing for that was negotiated back in 2021, before Embracer Group subsidiary Freemode acquired Middle-earth Enterprises of the Saul Zaentz Company in August of 2022. What a mess. But the big news here was that this set would be modern legal. This is a big point of contention in the anti-Universes Beyond argument. It's one thing for players to be given the option to play with these cards in Legacy and casual formats like Commander, but once they start impacting the meta of competitive formats, that seems to be where many people draw the line. The way it seems to me, this is the distinction that I think differentiates much of the player base in a way that isn't talked about enough. Flavor versus function. Ristic Studies' Framing 25 Years of Magic, A History of Magic Card Frames brought this distinction to the forefront of discussion with regards to a card's appearance. However, I think there's another layer here. If what he describes is the flavor versus function of a card's aesthetic, what about the flavor versus function of its existence as a game piece? Because players will naturally lean more towards one side of this argument than the other. Are you the type of player to build a Krenko deck with only goblins? Or are you willing to compromise the integrity of your theme to throw in an Imperial Recruiter? Is the function of your deck more important than its flavor? Or is it the other way around? This is where I think Universes Beyond separates the player base once again. Because now, there's still one side to function, but two sides to flavor. Now you have to ask, are you willing to compromise the integrity of your Krenko deck by adding Moria Marauder, increasing its functionality but compromising the uniformity of its flavor by including cards from another universe? To me, there is no similar separation in the player base who builds around functionality. CEDH decks run Lotho Corrupted Sheriff and the One Ring because they are good, powerful cards. Flesh Duplicate and Orcish Bowmasters have found a home there too, and whether they are loved or hated has much more to do with how efficient they are as a game piece than their ludonarrative. For a competitive player, you play the cards with the best rules text. It doesn't matter what art is printed on them. So I hear the outrage about Universes Beyond cards in Modern and now in Standard with the announced Spider-Man set, but to me it doesn't seem to matter. For a truly competitive player, all narrative is essentially backdrop. It has never been a priority. Players didn't love or loathe Tarmogoyf because of its origins in Scandinavian folklore. They did so because of its absurdly pushed stat line. That will not ever change. While the discussion surrounding Universes Beyond has been largely negative, it's becoming increasingly apparent that sales are up. This seems to be working, which creates a disconnect. If people don't like this, why are they buying it? This dissonance leads to speculation that sales are driven by collectors and investors and gambling addicts, that these sales are not generated by quote-unquote Magic fans. And to some extent, I do think that's true. But when players claim that these people might not become converted to real players, I have to scoff. Because that's just willful ignorance. When the Lord of the Rings set came out, I was ecstatic. Not because I was a huge fan of the movies. I watched them, they were good. I've read the books, I've read The Hobbit. But I was so much more excited because this finally gave my friends an excuse to go out to an LGS with me. One of my friends even bought a collector booster, precisely for the reason many Universes Beyond doomsayers said would happen. He wanted to go gambling. Then he bought another. And maybe a couple of set boosters too. And then before long, he had a veritable collection of Magic cards, and he wanted to learn how to play. When another friend was a huge fan of D&D and Arcane, I showed him to the appropriate sections at the game store. And so now, a year later, having converted all my friends to Magic players by appealing to them with varying combinations of Warhammer, Lord of the Rings, D&D, and Fallout, we play weekly. And that Lord of the Rings fan, he runs his Atraxa in the Eldrazi deck that he brewed after falling in love with Phyrexia and the Blind Eternities. My D&D friend plays his Giada deck that I brewed with him, and sometimes his Kaalia deck that he made himself. My friend that bought a Warhammer precon now runs his Massacre Girl deck after he saw the Secret Lair art of her and loved it. And beyond the people that I had some hand in converting to Magic players, I've seen the effects of this trend with everyone I play with. When I don't play with friends in a basement or at an LGS, I play on my college campus at clubs, and the vast majority of the player base there only learned how to play within the past 2 years. And while some of the games might be between Lara Croft, Aragorn, and Dogmeat, most aren't. Most of the games are between the new Duskmourn and Bloomburrow commanders that people wanted to build around, or proxies of the new Foundations cards. These people haven't been fans forever, but that doesn't mean that they aren't allowed to love this game. That doesn't mean that they're less of fans than you. Magic's high fantasy aesthetic appeals to a very specific niche of person, and it has been massively successful in catering to that audience. But Magic as a game has the potential to appeal to an even broader audience that just need an aesthetic motivator to start playing the game. That's what Universes Beyond does. It sets a backdrop that people are already familiar with that encourages new players to pick up a deck for the first time. And more people playing Magic is always a good thing. This design philosophy seems to have seeped into the more traditional sets as well. Recent expansions, including Outlaws of Thunder Junction and Duskmourn House of Horror, have begun to push the bounds of Magic's more traditional concepts of fantasy. While some people have maligned these sets, to me they seem to hold an obvious place. They bridge the gap from Universes Beyond to traditional Magic. They bridge the gap from the new to old, as new players segue into the lore that this game contains. This trend seems to have continued for the newly announced sets this year, with Aether Drift and Edge of Eternities providing a familiar, but still Magic, backdrop for these transitioning players. Magic's player base is undergoing a metamorphosis as much as the game itself is. And I think Foundations and Tarkir Dragonstorm are confirmation that these futuristic sets are not what Magic is going to become forever. They exist to bridge the gap to the traditional high fantasy aesthetic that is present in Tarkir, that is at the core of Magic's essence. Dragons are not to be replaced with race cars. They just have to share the spotlight with them as Magic does something it hasn't done before, at least in this capacity: cater to multiple audiences at once. The introduction of reality into the game world isn't just a new phenomenon either, though it's certainly become more pronounced in recent years. While much of early Magic's design space was occupied by sets inspired by real-world mythologies, this quickly became messy, something I think best explored in Ristic Studies' video, The Old Kamigawa, Japanese Traditions and Customs in Magic. Kamigawa, Arabian Nights, and later sets including Theros, Kaldheim, and Amonkhet evoked real-world cultural beliefs, to varying degrees of success, some of which have aged better than others. However, I think it's important to remember that the introduction of science fiction and horror elements aren't a new concept either. Urza's, Mirrodin, and Zendikar blocks introduced us to Phyrexians and Eldrazi, largely science fiction-inspired races with origins in body horror and cosmic horror respectively. Later on in Kaladesh, we saw the introduction of even more technological advancement in the world of Magic, and even more still in the Return to Kamigawa and Neon Dynasty. Mystical cowboys and a haunted house dimension don't quite fit the theme that many people think of when they imagine Magic's dragons and wizards and gods, but the groundwork for these expansions have always been present in Magic's development. Broadly speaking, I believe that negative sentiments surrounding Universes Beyond stem from two facets: gameplay and greed. However, I've found that people have less of a problem with the first than the second, so I'll try to keep this section brief. To begin, I'd like to give a comparison. This is Narcy Fablesinger. She was released in August 2023 with the Commander Master set. She's one of the first Sagas Matters commanders that we've ever been given. She has 4,222 decks on EDHREC and is currently the 353rd most popular commander of the past 2 years. And this is Tom Bombadil. He was released in June of 2023 with the Tales of Middle-earth set. He is the first Sagas Matter commander ever printed. He has 14,561 decks on EDHREC and is currently the 39th most popular commander of the past 2 years. Notice the difference? Now, maybe the additional 2 colors really help Bombadil that much, or maybe the extra month he was out is really the kicker here, but I think the more likely rationale is that despite both of these cards informing unique, fun gameplay, one saw a lot more play because players are already attached to the character. And this brings me to my first point about Universes Beyond. The cards printed in these sets encourage exploration into unique and interesting gameplay mechanics. It's no surprise to anyone that Commander is the most popular Magic the Gathering format. And with the release of Universes Beyond products, which have a plethora of legendary creatures from your favorite franchises with which to build a deck around, many people will gravitate towards characters they enjoy rather than playstyles they enjoy. Now, none of this changes that sagas as an archetype totally suck, but that doesn't matter. Having an excuse to build a new deck is half the fun for lots of people, and this can be extremely engaging for your entire playgroup. And while having an all-out brawl between Legolas, Iron Man, Chun-Li, and Optimus Prime might seem hellish to some players, to quite a few others, it just sounds like a blast. I love that these cards encourage players to look into new synergies and build around new themes, because that is part of what I love about this game. It seems like there's endless discovery in Magic because of its legacy, and so encouraging people to go digging to find the pieces they need to turn Rainbow Dash into an unstoppable war machine is exactly the type of incentive that I think makes this game so fun. This translates directly to game design as well as gameplay. Spice 8-Rack's admittedly less positive video than mine on the same topic discusses how working under the constraints of developing unique mechanics to fit into existing IP creates interesting design, such as the implementation of Fallout's rad counters. And that's far from the only example. New mechanics have been produced for many of the Universes Beyond products, like the time travel mechanic in Doctor Who, utilizing the already existing time counters, giving a new burst of life to the otherwise antiquated suspend mechanic, or the free-running mechanic from Assassin's Creed, drawing on the historically present theme of assassin creatures needing to deal combat damage to get their effect. These mechanics are clearly developed with a deep love and respect of the game. But if you feel that that love is wasted on tie-in products meant to appease the bottom line, I can understand the frustration, especially when mainline sets continue to pump boring and confusing mechanics with face-down cards or collecting evidence. I'm glad that new players exposed to Magic will be brought into the game by sets with characters that appeal to them as well as engaging and fun gameplay, but it does sadden me that this seems to come at the expense of the fun more enfranchised players have from standard Magic the Gathering sets. Now, don't get me wrong, cards with unique mechanics and standard sets can encourage the same brewing frenzy in many players. Examples of this can be found in just about every set Wizards releases now since they've started designing cards for Commander everywhere. When Obika was released in OTJ, people went feral buying up every upkeep trigger in Grixis that Wizards ever printed. But Universes Beyond cards serve the unique function of encouraging new players to become brewers. It's way more fun for new players to discover EDHREC and Scryfall in the pursuit of the perfect Lara Croft deck than to try and upgrade a precon filled with characters they don't know anything about. I could gush for hours about how much I love the design of River Song or Mr. House and how they interpret the unique mechanics of the characters in their original settings by using Magic's rule system, but I think most people have at least one example of this already done extremely well, so I digress. Now, to fully understand the story of Universes Beyond and Magic's greedy corporate overlords, we need to go back to the start. Because despite what it may seem like from how many people talk about this game, Hasbro isn't new to the story of Magic. In fact, it's likely been involved in Magic's history far longer than you or I. Richard Garfield approached Peter Adkinson, founder of Wizards of the Coast, in 1991 about producing a board game called Robo Rally, which Adkinson turned down, requesting something more portable. Garfield complied and returned a short while later with Magic the Gathering. WotC was in the middle of a lawsuit, so Adkinson set up a company called Garfield Games to shelter the development of Magic from the legal disputes that WotC was involved in. When the suit was settled in 1993, Garfield Games was dissolved and Wizards unveiled Magic in July of 1993. As the card game took off, Wizards quickly became flush with cash and shortly after purchased TSR, the makers of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the publishing rights to the Pokemon trading card games. These moves attracted the attention of toy manufacturer Hasbro, who acquired Wizards of the Coast and all their IP in 1999, and thus, the era of modern Magic was born. One of the criticisms that I think merits deeper conversation is one that's, I think, not as indicative of a malaise surrounding the current state of Magic as it is the current state of the world. If you live in America, like I do, the commodification of everything can get, well, depressing. It can be overwhelming to be inundated with advertisements and sponsorships at every turn, and it can very often lead to a melancholic, even nihilistic view on the capitalistic system we live under. And so, the baggage that comes with that shifting worldview invading your favorite card game, something that used to be a haven from the outside world, an outlet for fantasy, might be, well, sad. Infuriating even. And that sucks. So, I totally understand the feeling that something that brings you joy being invaded by corporations and advertisements is disheartening. However, I don't think that in this case it's an entirely bad thing. Because despite what it may seem like, Magic being about making money is not a new concept. Magic is a collectible trading card game, emphasis on the collectible. The purpose of this game, as it exists as a property of Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, is to generate profit. It is a commodity to be developed, produced, and sold. And Wizards has always done their best to bolster that bottom line. This is where I think discussion of the segments of Wizards' revenue, as well as how much of Hasbro's revenue is attributable to Wizards, becomes so fascinating. Because in researching for this video, I feel like I've begun to understand why certain segments of Magic exist at all. We'll start with MTG Arena and MTG Online. While both exist concurrently, MTG Arena has largely superseded MTGO in terms of player base and support. Online was released all the way back in 2002 and has been extremely successful throughout the ages. In 2007, MTG Online was said to be anywhere between 30% and 50% of the total Magic business. Recently though, in 2022, its upkeep has been transferred to Daybreak Games, a Sony subsidiary, while Wizards focuses more on MTG Arena. This is where the perfect storm occurred for Wizards, and why I think the focus on online play has grown over the past few years. MTG Arena was officially released out of beta for Windows users in September of 2019, and for macOS users in June of 2022. If you've been alive for the past few years, that time period might sound familiar to you, because it would have just been about the perfect time to release the online version of a game typically reserved to in-person meetups. The release of MTG Arena just so happened to coincide with the pandemic, and this was a huge boon to the game. Releasing to an estimated 3 million players in 2019, this number quickly skyrocketed to over 7 million monthly users. Around the same time, in December of 2019, the first ever Secret Lair was released. This wasn't a Universes Beyond product like the Walking Dead Secret Lair a year later, but was instead special art versions of beloved cards. And these released around the same time for a very particular reason, and I think are indicative of the rationale of Wizards management. Aside from having conveniently released an online game and a direct delivery product months before a global pandemic, both of which were likely huge boons to the sales of these product lines, they are both direct-to-consumer products. This is massive for Wizards, and I think is the less talked about rationale behind the secret lair inundation that we've seen over the past few years. Because I don't think a lot of players fully understand how Wizards makes money off Magic. Wizards doesn't sell any packs or booster boxes directly to players. Instead, they sell these products, without an MSRP now, directly to local game and retail stores, who then mark up the products to sell to players, allowing both companies to make money. This is typical of a value-adding system. Wizards makes the product, game stores and retail stores provide a front for them to be sold out of, constituting a markup, and so both agents make a profit. However, Wizards doesn't get to see all the benefits of extremely popular products when this happens. If the secondary market for certain products becomes huge and rare cards become massively inflated in value, Wizards doesn't see any of that excess profit. Hence, the direct-to-consumer model. With MTG Arena and Secret Lairs, when you buy one of these products, Wizards collects 100% of the profit. The desire for a direct-to-consumer model of business is expressed throughout WotC's managerial documents, and this pathway has become massively profitable for them. It's in part what has made WotC, and particularly Magic, Hasbro's most lucrative business by far. Which brings me to Hasbro's role in this. Having read through annual reports, quarterly reports, listening to investor conferences and the like, none of which I recommend you do, by the way, if you value your sanity, it has become clear to me that Magic the Gathering is the jewel in Hasbro's crown of toys and collectibles. And this is not some broad assumption. On the investor relations page, there are very few things visible. There are PowerPoints and graphs about sales, there's information about events, and then there's a big box asking investors to learn more about Magic the Gathering. There are no other brands on this page, it's literally only Magic. Which is crazy if you really think about it. Because from a cultural perspective, Hasbro's other brands like Transformers, Nerf, My Little Pony, or Dungeons & Dragons are all far more recognizable to the general population. As much as we may love this game, it definitely is a niche product. But the only thing Hasbro wants its investors to care about, the people it will cater to above all else, is Magic. Hasbro wants nothing more than for Magic to succeed. And while the definition of success for Magic that Hasbro might hold is slightly different from what you or I might hold, there is still some overlap there. It means more products and more players, and that is a good thing. Hasbro will tell you on this page that Magic is Hasbro's first billion-dollar brand, and they have some key metrics that I think are important to look at. Magic's player base is primarily aged 30 and up, ranging between 13 and 45 according to Hasbro. Importantly, they say that about a third of players are new, starting within the past 3 years, about a third of players have played between 3 and 10 years, and a third have played for more than 10 years. While it spooks me that I'm quickly coming up on being in that third demographic, for investors this is amazing news. It means that not only are player counts growing, but that this is a product that people are extremely loyal to. To me though, the funniest part of all of this is the huge picture of Teferi at the top means that somewhere, some suit is giving a presentation to their boss and they have to know Magic lore. They have to know who Teferi is in order to convince them to invest in Hasbro. That at least brings me a little bit of joy. Finally, the investor relations page states that Magic has grown at a 14% CAGR over the past 10 years. That's insane, frankly. CAGR is the compound annual growth rate, and while this metric's usefulness is largely comparative within an industry or between industries, for large capitalization companies, anywhere between 5 and 10% is pretty darn good. For context, the S&P 500's 10-year CAGR over the past decade was at 14.25% over the greatest bull market run in history, driven largely by big tech and AI companies. For an established tabletop collectible card game to match that is frankly ridiculous. Furthermore, some of the negative press WotC and Hasbro have received over their involvement in Magic is, I think, a little overblown. Not this, though. This is real. But remember the layoffs that happened around Christmas of 2023? Hasbro laid off 1,100 workers for a total of 1,900 that year, totaling around 20% of their total workforce. And the story became that this was concentrated heavily in WotC's D&D and Magic departments. This was outrageous. How could they fire the staff of their best performing division after an outstanding year? These greedy suits and their shareholders. But hang on. Because having dug into it, in actuality, those 1,100 layoffs seem to contain only a handful of WotC employees, totaling around 20. That's less than 2% of those layoffs. But because journals and YouTubers like to exaggerate the problem for clicks, this number became inflated until it became this. So reality 1, Reddit 0. Don't get me wrong, layoffs still suck, and it's unfortunate that anyone from WotC would get laid off. When layoffs are massive, like 20% of the workforce, that can certainly indicate mismanagement. But 20 out of over 1,000 employees at WotC is not bad, especially when it seemed they concentrated on bigger names that were likely becoming too expensive within the company. Now, all this is to say, Hasbro is not trying to ruin Magic. Hasbro fucking loves Magic. It's one of the only reasons that they're staying profitable as a business, which means that as players, we should have a lot of bargaining power. If we didn't like the direction of the product, not buying it would have a profound impact on Hasbro's stock. But the thing is, people are buying it. People are not boycotting Universes Beyond or Secret Lair en masse. They're gobbling them up. If the data shows that people like Universes Beyond and you don't, it's important to seriously reconcile why if you want to have an impact on the decisions being made during the future of Magic as a product. Because if we came together and actually wanted to do something, we could. But it requires uniformity. And if the community is split, this is the direction things are going. We need to decide if that's a good thing or not. I think that for most people, it's easier to blame individuals participating in a system than it is to blame the system itself. But at some point, it becomes necessary to realize that the bad behavior of individuals is purely motivated by the perverse incentives of the system, and not because of any personal moral failings of the individual. The same is true of larger entities acting as individual participants in a broader system. People don't have a lot of mental bandwidth. It is much easier to accept that there are bad actors within a system than that the system itself, in which they also participate, is flawed. Accepting that reality creates cognitive dissonance that their very existence within the system somehow contributes to the injustice which they seem to oppose, and so it can be easier to simply deny that reality altogether. Because honestly, I'm tired of hearing about everyone's problems with Universes Beyond and Magic and Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, when really what they're upset about is capitalism. There are not shady overlords pulling the strings that want to ruin your favorite card game for profits. They're the happiest when their players are the happiest. And if their advertising has brought in a new demographic of players that outnumber you, that's not a problem unique to Magic. That's just what the system incentivizes. The greedy suits are a fantasy. They're just people doing what people do, the best they can within the system that they live in. Statistically, most people that complain about this corporate greed also work for a corporation themselves. In fact, many people that complain about the suits over at Hasbro are likely suits themselves at some other company, working corporate to monetize some other product. The fact that how our society is structured incentivizes profits first is the problem, not the corporate heads that have done their best to adhere to that system. And until you reject that premise, they won't either. Because fighting the symptoms of a problem is a painkiller, not a cure. The foundation is rotten, but in a way that's much, much harder to fix than protesting a card game. Magic is a commodity, and it's one that we're very lucky to be able to indulge in. This is not a cheap product. A casual commander deck can easily run you hundreds of dollars, and a tournament-ready modern deck might run you thousands. Man, a vintage deck can run you more money than most people see in a year. If you're willing to blow that much money on a piece of cardboard, don't be shocked when corporations start to take interest. And if that sounds depressing to you, I understand. It depresses me too. But unfortunately, that's why it can be so easy to blame individual corporations with the tendencies that poison our favorite things. It's important to remember that it isn't some fantastical greed that drives people. It's a system that grants power to shareholders and creates the necessity to produce an ever-growing pile of money that can be returned to them. Greedflation does not exist. It's posturing, it's smoke and mirrors. There is no inflationary ghost that moves prices upwards when supplies start to cost more. Inflation as a concept only means that as costs for inputs go up, companies don't want to make less money because that would disappoint the aforementioned shareholders, so they offload the costs onto the consumer. And if they raise them higher than the cost, that isn't inflation anymore. It's just a price increase. It isn't greed, it's supply and demand. It's companies testing to see if consumers will pay more for products than they initially thought that they would. The individuals making decisions are so far abstracted from the individuals impacted by those decisions that calling it greed is reductive. The CEOs of companies don't giggle to themselves on Scrooge McDuckian piles of money. They make the decisions that will return more profits because that is what shareholders demand, and if shareholders demand it, they have to do it to keep their jobs. You can't demand that a company decide to just make less money if they're already profitable, because the system incentivizes growth. And if a CEO refused to do that, they would just get fired and replaced with someone who was willing to. If you wanted to just fix Magic, you could, technically. If you were to accrue $9.18 billion, likely more like 12, because acquisitions often require substantial premium to offset the opportunity cost of implied future returns, you could offer to buy Hasbro and take the company private. Then you'd have free reign to make whatever you wanted in Magic. without needing to please the shareholders by milking profits out of your precious IP. Just good luck accruing that much money without taking it from private investors who would also expect a return on their capital. Maybe you think that Universes Beyond dilutes the essence of Magic. I can understand that, but I have to disagree. Because to me, the essence of Magic has always been about bringing people that have nothing else in common together to have fun, to spread some joy, some happiness. And to me, that is what is at the core of this game that I love so dearly. Consumerism does a fantastic job of abstracting the self from the concepts of value, of production. Upkeep costs that are not inherently quantifiable, like happiness or quality of life, are often discarded as useless metrics that don't portray anything helpful about your value. Why do you think it is that understanding how to be happy is a foreign concept, a great secret of life? Surely with all our philosophizing, someone should have written a book, a step-by-step guide. But we don't value happiness the same as we do money. Because money is quantifiable and happiness isn't, we naturally tend to overvalue money and undervalue happiness. It is a natural byproduct of a system with imperfect information. Perhaps the sentiment that drives players away from Universes Beyond, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, Duskmourn, or Aether Drift is not that they tie in themes and products we're familiar with. Perhaps it's because they remind us not of the fantastical past that we usually like to be transported to, but rather the disappointing present. Because the high fantasy aesthetic of Magic the Gathering or Dungeons & Dragons allows players to escape the commodified consumerist world that we live in and, for just a few hours, exist in a plane where none of that matters. And it's being invaded. And that is sad. It seems to me that the unifying theme of many enfranchised players' disdain for this new breed of Magic is that it is a stark reminder of the real in a world that they've come to love precisely because it isn't. And maybe the real has always been present, in ways that we've been less tuned into, through Egyptian and Greek gods and goddesses, or homage to the cosmic horror pioneered in the 20th century. But it's much harder to ignore the cowboy hats and clue boards, the TV screens and TV characters that make themselves at home on the tables of our local game stores now. And I would be woe to disrespect those that came before me, to claim that the majority has spoken, that they voted with their wallets in an election we were promised would never happen, and that they outnumber you. No. Magic is evolving, and it's losing a part of itself that was precious to the people that made this game what it is. And if you feel left behind by that change, I'm sorry. You don't deserve to lose your escape from reality to the same corporatization that made you want to escape it. Magic has undergone a metamorphosis under all of our nostrils, and it's too late to stop it. I don't expect everyone to agree with my opinions in this video, but from my perspective, Magic is in a unique situation, where the discourse about this game is largely dictated by a small number of enfranchised players, while the player base at large has recently been inundated with new players who aren't yet prominent figureheads in the community, and the opinions of these new players aren't being heard. I want to give a voice to the silent majority, that people talk about when they discuss the appeals of the Universes Beyond to new players. Because I think that the natural evolution of this discourse means that, as this phenomenon becomes more and more implanted in Magic, the disdain will fade away. As new players brought in by Universes Beyond take their places as themselves figureheads of the community, the discussion will naturally shift as this new demographic finds their voice. This metamorphosis too will become mundane, given enough time. Once it is no longer a change and has become sedentary, the metamorphosis ends. It becomes just the way things are. So if you enjoyed this unnecessarily deep dive into a niche and likely unhelpful topic, like the video, subscribe, send it to your mom so she can understand the weird stuff that you like. Actually, probably don't do that last one. This is probably very unhelpful to that effect. Maybe send it to that one friend that you used to play Magic with back in the day, but just haven't talked to in a while, even though you've been meaning to reach out and just haven't gotten around to it. But now it's been so long that messaging them, "What's up?" out of the blue would be weird. Yeah. Maybe send this to that person. This is your sign.